The average person takes about 7,500 steps per day. Doing the math, the average person who lives until 80 will have walked a distance of around 110,000 miles in their lifetime. The ability to walk, to move freely, is a luxury that we often take for granted. When we meet up with friends, we walk. When we play sports, we run, and at our senior prom, we dance. The ability to move enables us to experience the milestones of life. It also provides us with a certain freedom. You can decide where you want to go, how you want to get there, and when you want to arrive. Those with physical disabilities depend on wheelchairs as the source of this freedom. It's their lifeline in a fast-paced world that would otherwise leave them trailing in the dust. And it's a tool that empowers them to live the lives they've always imagined. In developed countries, it's estimated that 10 million people require a wheelchair, and 95% have access to one. In developing countries, it's estimated that 122 million people require a wheelchair, and less than 10% have access to one. The primary reason for this disparity is a lack of government funding for public healthcare in developing countries. Consequently, it's not an anomaly to walk through the streets of small towns in countries like Guatemala, Bolivia, Cambodia, and find people young and old being tirelessly carried by their family members or even crawling on their arms. This is the current reality. But the right to mobility transcends social and economic class. Ken Baring, a Danville native, founded the Wheelchair Foundation in 2000 with the mission to ensure this right for all. And thus the Wheelchair Foundation started collecting donations and working with a manufacturing plant to develop their custom red wheelchairs. Mr. Baring led life-changing deliveries to some of the most impoverished areas around the world. In 2002, he and his wife Patricia traveled to South Africa to deliver wheelchairs alongside Nelson Mandela. But Mr. Baring realized that without involvement from youth, this movement he had created and dedicated his life to lacked long-term traction. So in 2009, the Foundations from the Heart Schools program was founded with 20 students from Treeview Elementary School in Hayward. That year, the students raised $200 to cover the costs of 2 wheelchairs bound for Chile. Currently, 50,000 students from over 50 schools participate in this program, and together they raise enough money for thousands of wheelchairs annually. The growth of this program was driven by the passion demonstrated by these students, and its objectives have since expanded beyond just fundraising. The From the Heart Schools program's goals are now to 1, raise awareness about the need for mobility around the world, 2, sensitize students to the challenges faced by those with developmental and physical disabilities, and 3, to raise money, to provide wheelchairs for those in need. Every year, my fellow Wheelchair Foundation ambassadors and myself help Amador make a meaningful contribution to this movement by hosting our own Abilities Awareness Week on campus. So at the beginning of November, student volunteers have the opportunity to spend their day in a wheelchair and experience the difficulties those with physical disabilities face on a daily basis. Students typically report back to us with endless stories about how simple tasks like getting from class to class, accessing a class on the second floor of the Q building, or even getting through a doorway suddenly become strenuous. At lunch on Thursday of the week, we hold a wheelchair basketball game in the quad so that students can learn how recreational activities can be modified for the use of wheelchairs. The overarching goal of Abilities Awareness Week is to shed light on life in a wheelchair and a potential life without one. If getting from class to class in a wheelchair is hard, imagine having a friend carry you the entire way, or even crawling there yourself. We found that students are more likely to empathize with these inconceivable hardships after witnessing their own peers overcome adversity throughout the week. Additionally, these events are held to encourage donations. Canisters are placed in every classroom for a month, and all the proceeds collected go towards funding for wheelchairs. When I first started out as an ambassador, that quickly became my tagline when I tried to explain to people what I was doing. Oh, funding for wheelchairs. But I learned that only scratched the surface of what I was doing. I evolved from believing mobility is important to understanding that mobility is a right, thanks to one transformative experience. In the summer of 2019, I went on the Wheelchair Foundation's annual distribution trip to several rural towns in Colombia. I wanted to see firsthand exactly what I was raising money for. It was my first time in South America, and the landscape was picturesque: green valleys, rustic churches, and clear skies. Each distribution was held in a town square. I was overwhelmed by the number of people who gathered around just to watch. What I expected to be a simple delivery turned out to be a heartfelt ceremony that was different for every town we visited. I had the opportunity to watch people be lifted from their family members' arms and placed in brand new wheelchairs. Several interactions I had with families are ones I will never forget. There was a young girl named Erica, and she came for a wheelchair with her mother and sisters. Her mother approached me and asked if I spoke Spanish. I said no, and immediately felt a tinge of regret for taking French. After a few seconds of emphatic hand gestures, I was under the impression that she wanted me to take a photo of her family. I tried to reach for her phone, but she shook her head no. Then I realized she wanted me to take a photo with her daughter. I was confused as to why her attention was directed particularly towards me, but I knelt down next to Erica and smiled for the photo. After one of our translators was called over, I began a very broken conversation with Erica, and she revealed that she really wanted to meet me the moment she saw me. Her endearing confession left me speechless, because there was nothing that set me apart from the rest of the group. I was wearing a blue polo and jeans just like the rest of them. But this 8-year-old girl, who had faced more adversity in her lifetime than I ever will, sought friendship in me. And soon any confusion that I felt became irrelevant. It didn't matter that there wasn't a reason why she reached out to me. The point is that she did. Her capacity for companionship and laughter, despite a life marked by disappointment and loss, was inspiring. And soon the wheelchairs weren't just assembled pieces of metal. They were a means of living for people like Erica, to ensure that she could attend school, play tag with her sisters, and go to church with her family without her mom having to carry her for 2 miles. The wheelchair ensured that her love for the world could be met by a world that would love and appreciate her. Whether it was a mere smile or tears, every interaction I had was uniquely poignant. And I left that town with a clear sense of purpose. I realized that the donations don't fund wheelchairs. They underwrite the right to live and explore, the right to mobility. But Erica is still one of the luckier few. Some people with a physical disability not only lack a wheelchair, but also cannot be carried by their family members or don't have anyone to carry them. One of our more intimate interactions on this trip was our at-home delivery. A man named Juan was full-body paralyzed due to a mishap during neurosurgery, and his elderly mother was his sole caretaker. Since she couldn't carry him to our distribution site, we traveled to their home to drop off his wheelchair. We arrived to find Juan lying on a couch that was obviously too small for him, with limited light streaming in through a window near the ceiling. But otherwise, the room was dreary and slightly suffocating. We listened to his mom explain how he became paralyzed, how she manages their daily lives, and how Juan was confined to just his bed and the sofa. Juan's mother was admirable in her attempt to take care of him. As a caretaker, she puts her own life and needs second. Her life revolves around another person. And meeting these families made it evident that caretakers derive their own sort of freedom from the wheelchairs. They no longer had to carry around the weight of their loved ones on their shoulders, both physically and mentally. But even with his mother's endless devotion to his care, Juan's sedentary lifestyle was an evident problem. Lying on a bed or couch all day puts a lot of pressure on the spine, leading to back pains and long-term spinal damage. And his lack of exposure to natural light was threatening his body's immune system. But giving him a wheelchair, these risks reduced tenfold. And before he became paralyzed, Juan loved art, so we saw beautiful handcrafted paintings all around the house. And on the side of the house, there was a large mural of a rose, which Juan's mother had painted in an attempt to keep his love for art alive. She said that Juan had instructed her to use certain colors and strokes to create the mural. With his mom acting as his arms and hands, Juan could continue to pursue his passion. But lately, he had abandoned any efforts to continue painting. Since he was limited to the view of his bed, it was clear he'd lost artistic inspiration. Now, with a wheelchair, Juan could continue to roam the streets with his mother and rediscover the beautiful art that made his life whole. But delivering wheelchairs to people like Juan and Erica is just the first step. They will still run into difficulties if people with physical disabilities are not accommodated for in public spaces. The Americans with Disabilities Act, enacted into law on January 26, 1990, requires that all places of public accommodation, accessed and open to the public, be compliant with their guidelines for accessibility for persons with disabilities. That's why you find a ramp or elevator anywhere you find a flight of stairs. But this public accommodation is not promised by law in many developing countries. Take my trip to Colombia, for instance. One of our foundation coordinators who accompanied us, Josh, has been in a wheelchair his whole life. He's traveled around the world in it, and he's very skilled with the chair. But there were still places he could not access due to a large flight of stairs unaccompanied by a ramp or even heavily unpaved roads. It may not seem like it, but this is a form of discrimination. It restricts a group's freedom to visit certain places or use certain facilities. Thus, it's important that our efforts to fund wheelchairs are coupled by lawmakers' efforts to advocate for and ensure handicapable public accessibility in every country. To finish, I'd like to leave you all thinking about a few names. Stephen Hawking, one of the world's greatest physicists, created the theory of the universe. Franklin D. Roosevelt was the 32nd president of the United States. Frida Kahlo, one of Mexico's greatest painters. The commonality between these three people, besides an impressive resume, is that they all used a wheelchair. And because they had this mobility, they were able to make their contributions to the world and live their fullest lives like every person deserves. To put it simply, without a wheelchair, the lives of those with disabilities are black and white. There are things they can do and things they can't do. With a wheelchair, the world suddenly has so much more to offer, and subsequently, they have so much more to offer the world. Thank you.